E3 is now officially dead. Let us give it a moment of silence.
Quiet. We will start over.
E3 is the now defunct gaming convention slash trade show in which a lot of companies would advertise brand new games, as well as showing off some state-of-the-art technology.
You ever wonder what the bottom of an Avatar shoe looks like? Well, bam! There it is.
It really was a time of peace. Since this was an annual event, a lot of companies would go all out to try to impress their audience on why they were the best brand, with each event having some grand moments for the entire audience to soy at.
I am hungry.
It also meant that we would get a lot of not that. But despite that, all these moments, the good and the bad, were all part of the E3 experience, and is what made E3, E3. But as the years went on, the need for a grand convention to show off the newest releases was no longer needed, since we can now get information directly from gaming companies thanks to the World Wide Web instead of having these big and elaborate shows. E3 went from being a pivotal part of the gaming industry to an afterthought that was losing more and more support by the year. So I wanted to go over it all, from E3's humble beginnings, its grand moments, and why it was never going to last.
I guess you may see it later. We're continuing?
Before E3 was the premier trade show for all video games, there was CES, or the Consumer Electronics Show. This is an annual trade show where tech companies show off their latest consumer electronics to the public, and it started all the way back in 1967. A lot of tech products were first premiered here, such as the home VCR, CD players, and of course, video game consoles. While video games were first seen as a fad, the market proved to be quite lucrative, continuing to grow with each coming year. But even as a promising market, they were never seen as a priority by CES, and as a result, ended up being mishandled by the event. While other larger industries got all the glamour and resources to show off their latest products, video games were even lucky to get a chance to present at all, being given smaller venues, and even once being placed outside in a parking lot on a rainy day. According to former CEO of Sega of America, Tom Kalinske, during that particular year, it was raining so much that water actually seeped through the tents and into their exhibit, causing some of their new Sega Genesis models to get wet. This angered Tom so much that he vowed to never return again. They returned the following year. Despite how little CES cared about video games, this was still the premier place to get the news out about the latest tech, and unless someone was perhaps smart enough and cool enough to start a trade show of their own that focused exclusively on video games, then they were out of luck. Luckily, someone decided to do just that. Pat Farrell, founder and president of gaming magazine Gamer Pro, decided to pitch the idea of a gaming exclusive trade show. Patrick has some sway in the industry since he had some experience running trade shows, such as with Macworld, giving him a lot of leverage on this novel idea. While some game companies were reluctant to leave CES at first, most companies such as Sega jumped on board almost immediately. Once more support grew for this brand new gaming trade show, this got CES to recognize the video game industry and finally offer video game companies their own space at CES in a completely separate trade show. But by the time this was offered, it was obvious that most video game companies were in support of this new trade show, so CES dropped their plans, and thus the Electronic Entertainment Expo, or E3, was born. The first E3 was hosted in 1995 at the LA Convention Center, and it was an immediate success, having an approximate attendance of 38 to 50,000 guests. This pretty much cemented E3 as a mainstay for the video game industry. The trade show was divided into two distinct parts: the press conference, which each of the major game companies will give out public updates on their latest plans, releases, and everyone's favorite, sales charts. Then there was a show floor where demos and videos would be available for the press to see. While this event did blow past expectations, nobody expected it to have such a grand moment right off the bat as well. For some context, Nintendo and Sega were still the big boys at the time, but this year was when then newcomer Sony was set to enter the video game market with the PlayStation. Nintendo had already announced that their new console, the Ultra 64, was being delayed to the following year, so really it was a battle against Sony and Sega, who who were also set to release their new console at the time, the Sega Saturn. While everyone makes fun of Nintendo for backing out at the last minute to make the PlayStation with Sony, Sega had actually made the same mistake as well, as they were also set to create a console with Sony. But much like Nintendo, the deal ended up falling through, mostly because higher-ups in Sega were skeptical if Sony could even make a video game console. Fast forward to 1995, and this led to the conundrum that was the botched announcement of the Sega Saturn. This 32-bit system was promised to have cutting-edge technology, as well as making the switch from cartridges to CDs. But due to the fact that the PlayStation was already outselling the Saturn in Japan, Sega thought it would be a great idea to launch the console early in the States, announcing during the E3 press conference that the Sega Saturn was available that very same day. This shocked everyone since this was extremely unprecedented, and Sega would also announce that their console would have a starting price of $399. Afterwards, Sony made their press conference, but when Steve Race, then president of Sony Computer Entertainment of America, that's a mouthful, went up on stage, he made the now famous one-word speech.
$299.
This moment pretty much made Sony instantly win not only E3 but the console war before it even started, and will be the start of many iconic moments that truly made E3 somewhat exciting to watch. While it really isn't a thing that matters, and honestly even now still doesn't matter, these type of moments are what fans would compare for each of the major press conferences that year and see who won that year's E3. This year was obviously a slam dunk by Sony with just how badly they beat Sega, and Nintendo pretty much forfeit since that year their only major showing was the Virtual Boy. And despite this E3 not really resembling the grand press conferences that we know of today, that iconic mic drop moment from Sony would cement this friendly rivalry with each of the companies trying to outdo each other and make the following press conferences more and more elaborate. While the PlayStation reveal was pretty iconic, it was actually not that well known since most people would have probably heard of it secondhand, either by reporting at the time or with very low quality footage that was posted online. It also didn't help that E3 was an industry-only event, meaning the only way to get in was by basically knowing somebody. It wasn't until 2005 that E3 would even be broadcasted on TV on G4, the only channel to play cops and Ninja Warrior for 24 hours straight. And video games too, I guess.
Believe it or not, it's E3.
The biggest, baddest video game expo, live on G4.
This is how I and many other people even became aware of this event in the first place, and it's pretty nostalgic to think about now. It was a week of brand new reveals in video games. As someone who didn't have access to the internet till much later, this was an event that I always look forward to, especially the press conferences. While most people may think the idea of sitting through a press conference will be a pretty boring ordeal, they would be half right, but these press conferences will have grand moments that get the entire audience truly hyped up. But a lot of the older press conferences were definitely more on the business side of things, talking about sales, graphs, and stuff, with the occasional video game trailer sprinkled here and there. Once E3 was broadcasted on TV, however, the tone and presentation almost immediately shifted. Just look at the difference in tone with Nintendo's E3 in 2004.
Now, new ways of interacting aren't just limited to the GameCube. Now, as you're all aware, Pokemon has again taken the market by storm in Japan.
To their E3 in 2007.
My body is ready.
The difference is night and day, and a lot of press conferences would have a similar evolution. As E3 continued to grow more and more, so would the grand moments and reveals. It felt like each company knew which games their fans would be truly passionate about, and would find creative ways to reveal them. Sometimes a reveal would be just perfect, building up a game that no one saw coming, but would still have the crowd go apeshit. Other times it would be revealing a game through a tattoo.
Is my new addition.
They did this twice, but despite that, these type of moments are what made watching E3 an experience and is something I don't think has been truly replicated. While I would love to go into detail about every grand moment in E3, I will instead go over one press conference that I feel perfectly captures what made this event so special in the first place. That being the Twilight Princess reveal. For some context, during the GameCube's production, a lot of tech demos were shown off on what this powerful little lunchbox could produce. One of these tech demos was a dark and gritty Legend of Zelda sequence, showing off a small fight between Link and Ganon. This caused many fans to assume that this would be the next Zelda title, but when Wind Waker was released instead, it was very much not that. This game is amazing, but back then, many Zelda fans hated this game for feeling too childish and not being the dark and gritty Zelda game that many fans wanted at the time. The tech demo was never going to be the next major Zelda game, but many fans yearned for this. In fact, Twilight Princess may have never happened if it wasn't for the fan outcry for Wind Waker. The next Zelda title would have been a direct sequel to that game, but with the rather poor sales, it caused the Numa to change course, instead making a more realistic Zelda game rather than stylized. This leads us to E3 2004. Nintendo was having a fairly tame E3, showing off some great games and exclusives, but just as they were gonna wrap up, Nintendo had one final announcement to end the show. They then showed a teaser for Twilight Princess, before Shigeru Miyamoto came out on stage, donning both the Master Sword and Hylian Shield. The crowd, of course, was perfectly respectful of the whole situation. While this moment may seem a bit corny to some, it was all the context that led to this moment being fondly remembered by many, even to this day. The rest of their E3 showing wasn't too bad either, showing off games such as Metroid Prime 2, unveiling the DS, and even showing off the greatest game of all time, Donkey Kong King of Swing. This is also Reggie's first year as president for Nintendo of America, who is probably one of the most beloved spokespersons of all time. So this E3 was pretty stacked to say the least. This was a great show for Nintendo, and I feel solidly that they won that year's E3. What did the other press conferences even have that year? Sony had a bunch of PSP games, some sequel games, and God of War, while Microsoft had Halo 2. That's not too shabby, but yeah, Nintendo stole the show this year. That was one of the great advantages of having a grand press conference for revealing a major title. There is just something so hype-inducing about watching a game being shown off for the first time and seeing in real time a bunch of people losing their minds about the newest title. There's something so awe-inspiring when you know a bunch of fans are all just as excited about the newest games as you are, and it's something that kind of brought the gaming community together, even if you didn't own the other consoles. But for every press conference that managed to get the entire room hyped up like there's no tomorrow,
$399.
there was also the many moments that didn't do that.
Peggle 2!
Where there's a yin, there's a yang. And nothing summarizes this better than looking at all the E3 moments that don't land well. For every your breathtaking moment
Is really going to be breathtaking. You're breathtaking! You're all breathtaking!
there are the jackasses that wouldn't shut up during Bethesda's press conference.
A lot of us.
And for every Reggie,
Yes, my body was ready.
you would then have a Mr. Caffeine. For every amazing gameplay reveal, you would then have games that don't show anything at all, or are just very boring to watch, and for every gameplay tech demo being shown, we would then have the many technical issues of games not working as intended. This is just an issue for any live event where anything can and will go wrong, such as when Skyward Sword was first revealed. This game heavily relied on the Wii's new Motion Plus controls, which would have fixed a lot of the unreliable old motion controls. So when Miyamoto was up on stage and the demo looked like this,
Same direction its mouth is open.
it pretty much shot the excitement of this game on the foot. Or even having a press conference focus on one game or gimmick for way too long, especially if that gimmick is more motion controls. Microsoft's Kinect definitely gets the worst of this, since this was a hands-free remote, which was very impressive for the time, but then having your audience sit through a bunch of actors pretending to play a game, it could get really awkward. It also didn't help that a lot of motion control games were very family oriented, meaning that the target demographic for these shows was completely off. But probably the worst of it is when a press conference just straight up lies.
Orange.
Claire drew a picture on a piece of paper. The piece of paper was held up to Milo. Natal recognized the piece of paper scanned the piece of paper in. Milo looked at that piece of paper, recognized the shape, recognized the color, and able to get on with his project.
There have been many countless games where it promises one thing, but when it finally releases, it looks like this. This is something that has disappointed many fans, since when a game is shown off to be this groundbreaking new game, only for the game not to be that at all, it rightly caused a lot of people to be wary of E3 going forward. And nobody was worse at this than Ubisoft, who for a while would sell games with the most amazing and jaw-dropping graphics you have ever seen, only for the game to not look like that at all on release. I think we all remember that original Rainbow Six trailer that promised a completely different game, or even Assassin's Creed's Unity reveal, showing off this amazing and robust world, only for the game to have one of the worst launches possible and it being buggy and unplayable on release. I do want to emphasize that this is rarely an issue with the developers, since they are more than likely crunching to even get a playable demo ready on a tight deadline, so it's only natural that some of these games will be completely different. E3 press conferences were made with the intention to sell these games after all, so having them lie about the true product became something that audiences have to be wary of. The signs of a game not being the real product became obvious, such as when a game made itself look way too good to be true, or only showing off a CGI trailer with no gameplay. But one of the most infamous examples of a developer just straight up lying about the game's true intention was of course No Man's Sky, where Sean Murray would go up on stage and pretty much promise a game that didn't exist, which I feel perfectly summed up why so many people became wary of what they were watching in the first place. It's even sadder knowing that half of these games that are hyped up to be these grand spectacles have a higher chance of not working on release, which has sadly become the norm. But worse than a press conference lying is when a press conference has nothing to show at all. We have all seen E3 press conferences where things could have been summarized in like 5 minutes, but when that is stretched out to an hour, these press conferences can really feel like a slog. There are some years where a company doesn't have anything to show, so to pad out for time, they either bring out a celebrity to hype up a game, or focus on a couple games for way too long. Worse if that same game has already been shown off at multiple other press conferences, which makes the event a lot less memorable as a whole. One of my personal favorite time wasters was when Sony's press conference decided to move their entire audience to a tent, where they then had the composer for The Last of Us play on their guitar for a bit before showing off gameplay for The Last of Us Part 2. And then when it was over, they had the audience awkwardly shuffle back to the real press conference. Like, why not just cut the tent and have them all be in one place? It was very jarring. But for whatever reason, more companies found more elaborate ways to waste time. Sometimes they would do a very cringeworthy skit that goes on for way too long.
We should come up with a meme really quickly for the show. Right now I'm pitching.
Or other times it would just be a long and awkward amount of time focused on something that isn't even a video game. For whatever reason, many press conferences thought it would be a great idea to bring an uninterested celebrity to present on stage, which honestly sucks a lot of the energy out of the show. But the worst time wasters has to be EA, who somehow found a way to combine the worst aspects of all of this into one big show.
Creator. So I am here to talk about Need for Speed.
EA isn't known for being the most beloved of the gaming community, and who would have guessed that they would usually have the worst elements of any press conference. They usually had a schedule full of their annual sports games, and maybe a new Battlefield or racing game if you were lucky. They would also try way too hard to be cool with the kids, but just failing spectacularly. But for whatever reason, despite having the least amount to show almost every year, EA thought it would be a great idea to present a day ahead before everyone else. Like, at least they had the courtesy of making sure I wouldn't bother with their presentation that year. But even with all this negativity, there was still something special about these press conferences, both the good and the very bad. While this is all fun and games, unfortunately, this was never meant to last. I think the first sign of things to come was when Nintendo decided to stop doing press conferences, instead opting to make a digital presentation where they would make all their major announcements. This was seen by many as really odd. It didn't help that their first digital presentation was rather weak and full of technical issues. It also had many questioning on why Nintendo wouldn't take advantage of having the big stage, since it was a major moment for any company to get the news out. And while the first E3 Nintendo digital announcement, or Nintendo Direct, didn't go exactly as planned, This would greatly foreshadow where things would be heading. With each coming year, Nintendo would seem to get better at handling a digital presentation, even to the point where they started to become a major highlight for each E3, as allowing for a digital conference gave Nintendo a lot of flexibility to do whatever they wanted.
Nintendo 64! My puppet body is ready.
And with only having to worry if the video wouldn't screw up this time, the Nintendo didn't have to worry if their demo didn't work on stage, or have a really awkward moment that could derail the show. That didn't stop them, of course, but that only made Nintendo's presentations a joy to watch. Nintendo's E3 showings became what many looked forward to, while Sony and Microsoft still held their press conferences that many became more critical of, with all the issues that I mentioned before growing each year. That isn't that people stopped caring about these press conferences, but the bar was set significantly higher. But what really put things for the worse was when Sony out of the blue announced that they would not be participating in E3 2019 at all. This was a huge blow, since having one of your 3 main events not be present showed a huge lack of faith in your show altogether, since around this time, a lot of people started to question if we even needed something like this anymore. Before, E3 was essential, since this was how most people would even be aware of what major games were being released that year. But as the internet became more and more accessible, an event of this scale that required so much work and coordination was simply not necessary anymore. Especially when you can now deliver the news directly to the fans instead. Just as things couldn't get worse for E3, major news stories broke that personal information from that year's attendees was leaked. This left a huge mark on E3's reputation as a whole, as the organizers behind the event, the ESA, felt like they were really behind the times and doing very little to update the format. It was most likely this and Sony leaving the event which may have caused the ESA to go into a panic mode and announce a grand reconstruction of the event. They announced big new changes to E3, as well as promising that they were not going to leak everyone's information this time, they promised. While people weren't exactly sure what this new E3 would look like, based on the ESA's website and some leaked information, it looked like they were trying to rebrand by having even more celebrities and social media influencers. Yeah, that's exactly what fans want. E3 was set to put itself back on track and nothing would be able to stop it. As long as a global event that wouldn't affect all of society didn't occur, then 2020 happened, which saw a lot of in-person events get cancelled, including E3. It's a shame too, because I was morbidly curious as to how different this new E3 would have been like. But alas, it was never meant to be. This would have been the final nail in the coffin, but E3 wasn't done yet, as it was announced that E3 will return the following year. 2021 was a strange year for E3. This would have been the first time they held an all-digital event, since most in-person events were still cancelled. And this could have also been an opportunity to finally update E3's format and finally get with the times. Unfortunately, this was by far one of the weakest for the trade show, since there wasn't much of a showing. Most games were delayed, and as a result, it left for a rather lackluster event as a whole. Worse yet, Sony once again was a no-show, instead making their own digital presentation around a month later. There is no telling how much interest this would have given E3, but Sony once again not being present really hurt the event. Not only that, but these digital presentations held independently would be far more cost-effective, since producing a video is far cheaper than renting out a huge stage and potentially screwing up. It was pretty clear where the industry was heading, but this still didn't stop E3, as it was announced that 2022 would be the grand return of the in-person E3. This is where things get a little strange, so I'll try my best to summarize what exactly happened. So E3 2022 would have been another in-person event like previous E3s, but earlier in the year, the in-person event was cancelled since the pandemic was still a thing. It was then announced by the ESA that they were incredibly excited about the future of E3 and looked forward to announcing details soon. But there was no mention if a digital event was going to occur that year, confusing many. It was then announced that E3 2022 was cancelled altogether, including the digital event, in March of 2022, with the ESA announcing that it would instead be focusing their energy on bringing back the in-person event by 2023. But in early 2023, it was then announced that both Nintendo and Microsoft would not be attending E3 that year. Soon after, more and more third-party publishers would also announce their departure from the event, and soon enough, it would be announced that E3 would finally be cancelled, permanently. E3 was just simply not worth it anymore, especially now that every major company now announces their games throughout the entirety of the year and no longer needed E3 to get the news out on their latest releases. What was also seen as an outlier and strange direction from Nintendo also proved to be extremely popular, as now all the major publishers have their own digital events that arguably produce more hype since it can happen at any time. The old format may have been fun, but it had so many flaws, and was forced into life support since it was not able to adapt in time, which unfortunately led to another show taking its place instead. While E3 is now done, we now have the Summer's Games Fest, presented by Doritos. This event is fine, but I do think that it's inferior to E3. For one, the whole event feels like an extremely prolonged ad. Like for every new game reveal, they would also have a 5-minute long ad or an in-game event from a game that's already been released. It just feels way too corporatized now, even worse than E3, which is also corporate to begin with. While this show may feel inferior, it has now become the de facto gaming event of the summer, which I guess was their goal all along. It does somewhat capture the old spirit of E3, but in a much less exciting form. It's crazy to think about now, but this era of gaming is now over, and it's a bit bittersweet knowing that an event like E3 could never happen again, at least not to this scale. The big three companies have now all moved on to their own digital presentations that many actually prefer, since it does seem to fix a lot of the issues that many people had with the old press conferences. But it's still nice to think about how these things once were, and looking back on the event has made me appreciate it a little bit more, both the good and all the very bad and awkward moments.